Chapter 9 of Clog Shop Chronicles by John Ackworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For better, for worse. 2. The denouement. When Johnty had left the Clog Shop fortified for the subjugation of his wife by the combined counsels of the Clogger and his satellite, Sam Speck sat rubbing his corduroys with his hands and mentally basking in the beams of self-complacency. That his own painful experiences had at last been turned to account for the benefit of a fellow sufferer was at any rate some consolation for the humiliation he had endured, while the role of counsellor, though somewhat new, was very flattering to his vanity. Leaning against the chimney back, and stretching out his somewhat bowed legs as far as they would go, he sucked away at his pipe in pleasing reflection. But with Sam, to think was to talk, and so in a few moments he broke the silence by assuming an air of great meekness and observing —" Well, efther all, it's summat to be able to gie your neighbour a bit o' help." " Ay, aat o' th' fryin' pon into th' feire," was the gruff rejoinder. This totally unexpected retort fairly staggered Sam. His jaw dropped, a look of surprised mystification spread itself over his face, and at length he asked —" Whatever dust meean, Jabe ?" Now, ever since Johnty's departure, a course of reflection had been passing in the Clogger's mind of an exactly opposite character to that which moved in Sam's. He realised that at that very moment a painful scene might be enacting itself in Johnty's house. He felt how serious a thing it was to interfere between man and wife. Then he began to remember how vague and unreliable was the evidence they possessed of Susy's weakness. Saving only her superior taste in the matter of dress, which might after all be accounted for by the fact that she had been a dressmaker. And when he came to think of it, all the Stoneses were clever and smart, and Johnty had admitted that he had never asked his wife how she spent her money. By this time things had assumed very serious shapes in his mind, and he had just begun internally to call himself and his fellow counsellor very hard names, when Sam's conceited remarks broke on his meditation, and surprised out of him the exclamation which so excited Sam's amazement. " Aw mean," he replied, in answer to his companion's last question, " as tha'rt a foo', an' Aw'm a bigger un, an' we're boath a pair o' meddlesome mischief makkers. For owt we know," he added, " yon little woman's cryin' her een aat be this time, an' —" But here he broke down, dashed his clay pipe petulantly to the floor, and dragging out of his thick leather belt an enormous red handkerchief, he blew his nose with most suspicious violence. Descending at one drop from self-complacent exaltation to a sense of meddlesome meanness, Sam was silent, and very soon sidled sheepishly off home, leaving the Clogger to sit far into the night torturing himself with self-accusations and visions of misery for Johnty and his wife. All next day Jabe was very uneasy. Johnty sometimes went back to his work after dinner, the longest way round for the sake of fresh air, and as this took him past the cloggery, Jabe, on the chance of seeing him, as the day was unusually fine, stood for nearly half an hour in his shop doorway, hoping to thus get some inkling of how matters had gone. But no Johnty appeared, and Jabe spent a very miserable afternoon. By tea time, however, he had made up his mind, and just before dark, after dressing himself with most unusual care, going in fact to the extreme of a shirt front in the middle of the week, he made his way down to Johnty's house. To his great relief, Susy looked as bright as ever, and welcomed him quite effusively. To his inquiry after her husband, she said that he had gone to Slakey Brow, 1.5 miles away, after some celery plants, but would soon be back. Jabe somehow felt immensely relieved, and would have excused himself, but Susy would take no denial. She put him in one of her new-fashioned easy chairs, and Jabe admitted to himself that these were easier than the Beckside straight backs. Then she got him a pipe, praised her husband's scented weed, and playfully compelled him to try it, charging the pipe herself, and even bringing him a lighted spill. When he had got fairly a going, she rated him teasingly about not having been to see them before, and suddenly remembering something else, brought him a glass of balm wine, and insisted on his drinking to their happiness. This unconscious coals of fire treatment made Jabe feel very bad indeed, but just then the baby, a sturdy young 10 months old, awoke, and Susy brought him to Jabe to look at, and so bewitched him that though he had scarcely touched a baby for 30 years, and felt dreadfully afraid of hurting it, he recklessly asked to be allowed to hold it, Susy, as he did so, stepping back and clapping her hands in admiration. She told him how well he looked, " nossing a babby," and asked him if he hadn't made a mistake after all in being a bachelor, and the poor Clogger was never nearer confessing that he had in his life. And then she began to talk to him artfully about himself, a temptation which no man can resist, and she did it so adroitly and unsuspectingly that Jabe was unconscious of the flattery of it, and would have felt very well pleased with himself but for the secret remorse that was stabbing him inwardly. " Hay, yo' doan't know yo're born till yo' get marrit, Jabe," she said. " Aw'm happier in a day naa nor Aw used to be in a year afore we wor wed." And this was the woman he had recommended should be subjugated. It had come into the Clogger's mind that perhaps before Johnty returned he might get an opportunity of speaking a word in season to Susy, and he made this excuse to himself for tarrying. But before long, partly through shame at the way he felt he had misjudged the Minder's wife, and partly from the intoxicating influence of Susy's presence and innocent chatter, he had thrown all reflection to the winds, and was enjoying himself to the full, reckless of all consequences. Johnty came at last, but strange to say, Jabe seemed to have forgotten what he came about, and departed presently without explaining his business. " Naa, Aw expect yo'll not be lung afore yo' come agean, Jabez," Susy said as she opened the garden gate. " No, wench, no," cried the Clogger, and hurried up the " broo " towards home. When he had gone a few steps and the door had closed upon Susy, Jabe stopped in the road and began to talk to himself. " Jabe," he said, " tha's made mony a fool o' thisel' i' thy time, bud tha's ne'er made a bigger than tha has this time, tha pryin', suspecious owd maddlin', tha." Then he proceeded, and as he climbed the low brow his face began to light up with amused gratification, and an almost simpering expression came upon it. But he pulled up again and said —" Whey, tha'rt i' luv wi' th' woman thasel', tha soft ninny, tha." When Susy returned to her husband after seeing the Clogger off, she found him in the best of spirits. " Aw mak' no account o' frisky young bachelors comin' to see thee when Aw'm aat o' th' road. He cut like a redshank when Aw turnt up." " Hay," cried Susy, " isn't it a pity th' owd chap's ne'er bin marrit? He doesn't know what he's missed, does he?" And as Johnty replied " No," she continued —" Bud Aw'st ask him daan here to his tay sometimes of a Sunday. He must be looansome. Dust think he's bin crossed i' luv, Johnty?" Johnty didn't know, but he ate his supper, and then, to stifle returning scruples, smoked out of his best new pipe and sat silently speculating on Jabe's visit. It was clear the Clogger had said nothing to Susy, but he wondered why he had come at all, and seeing he had come, what had prevented him speaking either to his wife or himself or both. But when Susy entered into a detailed description of the visit, giving all those minute particulars which only a woman can remember, Johnty's face beamed with amusement, and he went off to bed in a very comfortable frame of mind. Next day was Saturday, and the Minder came home between 1 and 2 o'clock. Just as he turned out of Sally's Entry, a short cut from the mill, he came upon a bill poster who was pasting an auction sale bill on the nailed up door of Long Ben's workshop. Johnty paused a moment and ran his eye carelessly over the bill, but presently came upon a paragraph which brought all the gall back into his mind. It read thus: — Lot 5. All that messuage dwelling house situate on the roadside adjoining the premises of Benjamin Barber, carpenter, in the hamlet of Beckside, and now in the occupation of Jonathan Harrop. Several others were gathering round the bill, but Johnty had seen enough, and turned sullenly home. He could not trust himself with his wife just then, so he made for the back garden, ostensibly to examine the condition of the celery plants he intended to set that day, but really to cool down and get command of himself. Johnty's house had been built by his grandfather, and had descended to his mother. Johnty himself had been born in it, and remembered with painful vividness the day when the mortgagee foreclosed and took possession, and widow and children had to flit to a smaller house. It had been a joyful surprise to him when he found he could take the house on his own marriage, and he had cherished the hope that he might one day be able to purchase it. And now, instead of being owner, he knew he could not remain much longer, even as tenant, for it was well known that Job Sharples, the pig dealer, wanted to buy the cottage, and in fact all the property about it. And when Job was in the market, there was no chance for anybody else. " Johnty, come lad, thy dinner's waiting," cried Susy from the kitchen door, but the Minder was angry and surly, and never deigned an answer. Presently, however, he went indoors. " Childer as cawn't do as they's towd gets their ears soused," said Susy playfully, suiting the action to the word. But Johnty began eating his food in sullen silence. When dinner was over, he walked to the front door and stood moodily leaning against the door post and smoking, ruminating bitterly the while on his troubles. " Johnty," cried Susy after a while, " arn't tha gooin' to set them sallery plants ?"" No, Aw'm not," snapped the Minder. " Haa's that ?" and Johnty turned round and nearly roared out. " 'Cause we're gettin' ta flit." " Flit ? Wot for ?"" 'Cause the property's gooin' to be sowd next Friday," and a feeling of utter despair came over Johnty as he observed that his frivolous little wife was not stunned by the news. Susy was perfectly aware how dear the house was to him, and how he had hoped some day to possess it, and yet in a few moments he heard her actually singing in the kitchen. The next few days were spent by Johnty in moody gloom, all attempts on Susy's part to cheer him being sullenly rejected. And on Thursday, the day before the sale, the Minder came home in a worse frame of mind than ever, ready, in fact, to pick a quarrel on the smallest possible provocation. But somehow Susy was prepared for him, and had sent the baby out so as not to annoy him. She had also adorned the tea table with cress and a nice bit of pig seause. " Johnty, con tha get off thy wark to morn, dust think ?" she asked, as she put a second piece of brawn on his plate. " Neaw !" Johnty almost shouted, and then glared angrily at his wife, expecting her to say something that would give him cause for going further. " Well, dunna shaat like that. Aw want thee to goa a bit of an errand for me." " An' have Aw nowt else to do but goa errands for thee ? It takes me aw my time to keep thee as it is." There the Rubicon was crossed, for the tone of Johnty's retort was even harsher than his words, and though he would have given worlds to have the word back, he kept up his hard look and glanced furtively across the table to see what effect he had produced. Every drop of blood seemed to have left Susy's face. An injured and haughty look rose into her eyes, and rising to her feet, she bestowed one cold, hard glance on Johnty and fled upstairs. To say that Johnty was miserable would be a very mild way of putting the case. He left his unfinished tea and went out, and after wandering aimlessly about for some time, turned into the Bridge Inn. But he could not stay, and by 9 o'clock he was back home again, and found his wife sitting sewing by the candle light. " Wheer dust want me to goa ?" he asked, in a tone between apology and protestation. " Noawheer. Aw con goa mysel'." And a second time Susy retreated to the bedroom. When he came home to dinner next day, he found, as he expected, that his wife had gone by the coach to Duxbury, and he felt painful misgivings as to his conduct, and was troubled with most unusual apprehension as to Susy's safety. It was an almost interminable afternoon, and when 6 o'clock did come, Johnty was almost the first man to leave the mill, although he worked in the top storey. He heaved a great sigh of relief as he caught sight of his wife stooping over the cradle, and went up to kiss her, but she eluded him with an averted face and went about her work. The Minder ate his tea in silence, his mind filled with conflicting emotions, whilst Susy hovered about the table and her husband quite strangely, but never gave him the chance to take hold of her, and carefully avoided meeting his eye. There was a very tall jug standing on the table, a show jug which Susy greatly prized, and which Johnty had never known her use before. " Wot's i' this jug ?" he asked, to break the uncomfortable silence. " Look and see," was the short answer, and Susy became instantly very busy amongst the baby clothes. There was a small plate on the top of the jug, and Johnty lifted it down upon the table and took the vessel up to explore its recesses. It contained a bundle of documents. " Whativer's thuse ?" cried Johnty, and took them out and began unfolding them. A moment's scrutiny showed him that they were the title deeds of his house, with a hasty memorandum and a receipt for the price. The sight nearly took his breath away, and also his speech, but presently he found courage to ask —" Wot's aw this mean, Sue ?"" It means as tha'rt thy own landlord, if tha wants to know." And there was a distinctly no compromise tone in Susy's voice. " Me a landlord ? Haa con that be ? Whoa's bowt it ?"" Aw have." " Thee ? Wheer'st getten th' brass ?"" Noa from thee. It tak's thee aw thy time to keep me, tha knows." Johnny winced and continued —" Wheer'st borrowed it ?"" Aw've ne'er bin used ta borrowin', Jonathan. Aw've saved it." " Thee saved it ?" And then the scales seemed to fall from the Minder's eyes. A great many things became clear all at once, and after a pause and a great reliefful sigh he rushed at his wife, and she ran upstairs again, and he after her. He caught her before she got to the top, for she was not very good at climbing stairs just then, and took her in his arms and brought her down, stopping on every other step to kiss her burning and teary face. Then he took her on his knee and held her very close, and compelled her to tell him all about it. There was nothing to tell, she said. She knew how much he would like to own the house they lived in for old association's sake. She had a little bit of money when they were married, but thought if he ever needed it, it would be so pleasant to give him a nice surprise. So as he never asked, she had never told him about it. Since their marriage she had put something by every week, and perhaps the fact that she was able to make her own and the children's clothes had helped her, as well as enabled her to make a pretty fair appearance. She had also made a few neighbours' dresses, but daren't tell him because he was sa soft about her. She had learnt about the sale of the cottage quite by accident, and had already opened negotiations for a private purchase when the auction bills came out, and his alarm about having to flit had rather hurried her. Oh, what a happy man was Johnty Harrop then ! He then made a full confession of all his suspicions, omitting only the Clog Shop incident. But he might as well have told her that also, for when Jabe and Sam came to tea on Sunday by special invitation, and heard the whole story, they confessed too, and Susy forgave them also with quite a queenly grace, and insisted when they had gone that their next baby should be called Jabez, as it very likely would have been, only it turned out to be a girl, and was christened Susan.